The champagne tasted like ash in Naomi's mouth. Around her, the grand ballroom of the Okura Tokyo glittered, a universe of crystal chandeliers and hushed, important conversations. She was a ghost in a purple silk dress, a translator hired for the evening, meant to be invisible, a seamless bridge between Japanese executives and their American counterparts. For the last hour, she had been just that. Fluent, professional, forgettable. Then she felt his eyes on her. She didn't have to look. She never did. It was a pressure change in the air, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Tatsuo was in the room. Her husband. The thought was still so foreign, so sharp-edged, it felt like swallowing glass. 3 months they had been married on paper, a contract signed in a sterile office with lawyers whose smiles never reached their eyes. A marriage of protection. His protection, her compliance. It was a simple, terrifying transaction. Naomi kept her posture perfect, her expression neutral, as she finished translating a drab comment about quarterly earnings. She gave a small, polite nod and stepped back, melting into the shadow of a marble column. From here, she could see him. He stood across the room, near the soaring windows that looked out over the city's electric sprawl. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He didn't need to. People gave him space, a wide, invisible berth of respect and fear. He wore a custom suit, charcoal gray, so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. It was the details that always snagged her attention. The dark gleam of his watch, the stark white of his shirt cuffs, and the sliver of intricate, dark blue ink that peeked from beneath one sleeve. A dragon's tail. A whisper of the world, he commanded. Her world had been resumes and rent payments and dodging calls from her mother. His was this. Power, so absolute it was silent. A voice, slick with privilege and unwelcome familiarity, slithered into her ear. Well, well, look what we have here. Naomi didn't have to turn. The scent of expensive, over-applied cologne and stale arrogance was unmistakable. Bryce. Her ex. The man who had measured her worth in public approval and found her wanting. Bryce, she said, her voice flat. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on Tatsuo, a distant anchor in a suddenly turbulent sea. I almost didn't recognize you, he said, stepping beside her, his presence a deliberate invasion of her space. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising drag of his eyes that made her skin crawl. Purple. Bold choice. Trying to get noticed. I'm working, she said, the words clipped. Right. The little translator job, he scoffed. He leaned against the column, crowding her. I heard you moved to Tokyo. Running away from something? Or someone? His smile was a weapon. Come on, Naomi. You can tell me. Still haven't found anyone to replace me, huh? He flicked his gaze down to her left hand, which was resting on her small clutch. He made a show of looking, a theatrical pout forming on his lips. Oh, that's right. Still no ring. I guess I didn't break your heart that badly if you're still so determinately single. Each word was a carefully placed needle, designed to draw the blood of her confidence. It was his specialty. He had spent 2 years perfecting the art of making her feel small. She lifted her chin, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. My romantic life is none of your business, Bryce. Isn't it? I feel like I set a high bar, he said, laughing. It was a loud, braying sound that turned a few heads. Who could possibly follow an act like me? You'd need a king, a god, to measure up. And last I checked, they don't hang around women like you. The insult, so casually delivered, hung in the air between them. Before she could form a reply, before she could summon the icy disdain he deserved, the temperature dropped again. This time it was a polar freeze. Tatsuo was there. He hadn't made a sound. One moment he was across the room, the next he was standing behind her, a monolith of silent menace. His shadow fell over both of them. Bryce, mid-smirk, seemed to shrink. He hadn't noticed the approach, and the sudden appearance of this man, whose stillness was more intimidating than any overt threat, threw him off balance. Tatsuo's hand settled on the small of Naomi's back. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a brand. A statement of ownership, delivered with the weight of an empire. The heat of his palms seared through the thin silk of her dress, a direct current to her spine. She froze. This was not part of their arrangement. Their arrangement was distance. It was safety. It was her name on a document that kept certain dangers at bay, and in return, she owed him something she had not yet been asked to pay. His voice was low, a gravelly whisper that cut through the ballroom's hum like a shard of obsidian. Is there a problem here? He wasn't looking at her. His eyes, dark and flat as a winter lake, were fixed on Bryce. They held no anger, no emotion at all. They were the eyes of a predator assessing a minor annoyance. Bryce, to his credit, tried to recover his swagger.
Who are you?
Her bodyguard. Tatsuo's fingers pressed slightly deeper into her back. A silent command.
Stay still.
I am the man who finds her lack of a ring irrelevant. The words were so precisely chosen, so devoid of inflection, that it took a moment for them to land. Bryce blinked, confused. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Tatsuo said, his gaze unwavering, that a queen has no need for a crown when everyone already knows who rules the kingdom. He took a half-step forward, closing the remaining space. He was taller than Bryce, broader in the shoulders, and carried an aura of lethality that Bryce's tailored suit couldn't mimic or defend against. You mistake an absence of decoration for an absence of value. A common error, made by common men. Bryce's face flushed a blotchy red. Listen, pal, I don't know who you think you are. You are correct, Tatsuo interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a private threat in a public space. You don't. He moved his hand from Naomi's back to her arm, his grip firm, inescapable. He began to turn her away, to lead her from the confrontation. It was a dismissal so absolute it was more insulting than any slur. But Bryce wasn't smart enough to let it go. So, what, you're her new boyfriend?
Good luck with that.
She's got a chip on her shoulder a mile wide. Tatsuo stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, only his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, reptilian. The air crackled. Naomi felt it in her bones, a primal warning to flee. Boyfriend. Tatsuo repeated the word as if it were a foreign object he was examining for flaws. A small, humorless smile touched his lips, a terrifying sight.
No.
He looked from Bryce's sputtering face to Naomi's bare left hand, the one Bryce had so gleefully mocked. Then he looked back at Bryce, his eyes holding a cold, final judgment. I am her husband. The words detonated in the quiet space between them. Bryce's jaw fell open. The color drained from his face, leaving only the angry red splotches behind. He stared at Tatsuo, then at Naomi, his mind visibly struggling to connect the woman he thought he knew with the man standing beside her. A man who looked like he could extinguish a life with the same casual ease he might extinguish a cigarette. Tatsuo gave her arm a gentle but firm pull. We're leaving. He didn't wait for a response. He simply began to walk, drawing her with him through the glittering crowd. People parted for them like the sea before a shark. Whispers followed in their wake, but no one met his eyes. Naomi moved on autopilot, her feet barely skimming the polished floor. Her mind was a whirlwind of shock and a new, terrifying understanding. The secret wasn't a shield anymore. He had just turned it into a cage, and the lock had just clicked shut. Her old life, the one where she was just a translator, the one Bryce could still touch, had ended the moment he spoke. She was his now, not just on paper, but in the eyes of the world he was dragging her into. And she had no idea if she would survive it. The silence in the back of the Maybach was heavier than stone. It pressed in on Naomi, thick and suffocating. The city lights of Tokyo blurred into streaks of neon and white gold through the tinted window, a world she was no longer a part of. Tatsuo sat beside her, but he could have been miles away. He stared straight ahead, his profile carved from granite, his jaw tight. The fury he had contained in the ballroom was now rolling off him in palpable waves, chilling the air in the enclosed space. He hadn't been angry at Bryce. She understood that now. He was angry at the breach, at the exposure, at her, for being a vulnerability he hadn't anticipated. Where are we going? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Somewhere safe, he answered, without looking at her. The words offered no comfort. Safety with him felt more dangerous than anything she had ever known. That was when she saw it. A dark sedan in the side mirror, its headlights too bright, too close. It had been there since they left the hotel. She told herself it was paranoia, a side effect of the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. But the car stayed with them, matching their speed, a shadow clinging to their bumper. She opened her mouth to say something, but Tatsuo spoke first, his voice calm and deadly. Kenji. Left at the next intersection. Lose them. The driver, a stoic man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, simply nodded. He didn't ask questions. The Maybach, a vessel of quiet luxury, suddenly became a weapon. Kenji wrenched the wheel, and the heavy car surged into a turn, tires squealing in protest. Naomi was thrown against Tatsuo, her hand flying out to brace herself against his chest. It was like hitting a wall of muscle and fine wool. His scent filled her senses, cedarwood and something clean, like cold night air. He didn't flinch. His arm came around her, a steel band holding her in place as the car fishtailed before Kenji corrected it, accelerating down a narrow side street. The sedan followed, more aggressive now. It rammed their bumper, the sound a dull, violent thud that reverberated through the cabin. Hold on, Tatsuo murmured, his voice low in her ear. His breath was warm against her skin. It was the most intimate contact they had ever shared, and it was happening in the middle of a battle. The world outside became a chaotic blur of darkened storefronts and glowing vending machines. Kenji was a master, weaving the large vehicle through impossibly tight spaces. A second dark sedan appeared, trying to cut them off. The first rammed them again, harder this time. The rear windows spiderwebbed with cracks. Tatsuo moved with a speed that was terrifying. He pushed her down, his body covering hers, shielding her as the side windows suddenly exploded inward, showering the cabin with a storm of tempered glass. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath. The car swerved violently again, and then they were through, accelerating onto a wider avenue, leaving the two sedans behind, caught in the traffic they had created. After several more minutes of tense, evasive driving, Kenji pulled into a subterranean garage. The gate hissed shut behind them, plunging them into concrete silence. It was over. Naomi sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Are you okay? Tatsuo was already shrugging off his suit jacket. There was a long, deep gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. A shard of glass was embedded near his elbow. It's nothing. That is not nothing, she said, her professional instincts kicking in. In another life, she'd briefly considered nursing school. She knew a bad wound when she saw one. He ignored her, speaking in low, rapid Japanese to Kenji, who was already on the phone. They ascended in a private elevator, the ride silent and tense. It opened directly into a penthouse apartment that was less a home and more a work of art. Minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a panoramic view of the city, and an overwhelming sense of cold, empty space. There's a first aid kit in the master bathroom, he said, walking towards the windows, his back to her. He stood there, looking out at the city he owned, his posture rigid. Naomi found the kit. It was stocked like a field hospital. When she returned, he was still standing there, his white shirt stained with a growing patch of crimson. Let me see, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. He turned slowly. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond cold control. A flicker of something.
Surprise?
Weariness? He looked at the kit in her hands, then at her face. He gave a curt nod and sat on the edge of a sleek leather sofa. She knelt before him, setting the kit on the low table. Her hands were shaking slightly as she began to clean the wound. The glass had torn through fabric and flesh. She worked carefully, disinfecting the area, her touch gentle but firm. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched her. His stillness was unnerving. Why did you do it? she asked softly, her eyes focused on her task. Back at the gala. Why did you tell him? He disrespected you, Tatsuo said, his voice flat. And, by extension, he disrespected me. It was just my stupid ex-boyfriend being an idiot. It wasn't worth this. She gestured with her head to his bleeding arm, to the memory of the chase. He was silent for a long moment. She risked a glance up at him. His gaze was intense, searching. Disrespect is a test. An enemy probes for weakness before they strike. They watch to see who is protected and who is not. To allow him to speak to you, that way was to paint a target on your back. She finished cleaning the wound and carefully extracted the shard of glass with a pair of tweezers. He didn't even flinch. As she began to bandage the arm, her fingers brushed against the skin near his wrist, against the edge of his tattoo. The dragon scales felt like raised scars under her fingertips. He finally looked away from her, his gaze turning inward, to a place of shadow and memory. I had a sister, he said, the words quiet, pulled from a deep well of pain. Her name was Akari. She was bright. Like her name. She had nothing to do with my world. She was a musician. Naomi paused, her hands still on his arm. She waited. A rival clan wanted to send me a message. They saw her as a weakness. A vulnerability. They saw someone I cared for who was unprotected. He took a breath, the sound ragged. I was too arrogant. Too slow. I thought my reputation was enough to shield her. I didn't see the disrespect for what it was. A precursor to violence. He stopped, but she knew the end of the story. She could feel the shape of it in the crushing silence of the room. He had failed to protect the woman he loved. A shame he carried like a shroud. I will not make that mistake again, he said, his voice like iron. He looked back at her then, and the raw emotion in his eyes stole her breath. It wasn't tenderness. It was a fierce, terrifying possessiveness.
A vow.
No one will ever disrespect you again. I will burn their world to the ground first. This was his wound. The ghost of his sister. The shame of his failure. And he had just laid it bare for her. In that moment, kneeling before him with his blood on her hands, she had a choice. Her passport was in her purse. The American embassy was a phone call away. She could run. She could disappear back into her old life. But she looked at the bandage she had just tied, at the dark, haunted eyes of the man who wore his power like armor to hide a gaping wound. And she knew she wasn't going to run. She made a deliberate choice. She picked up the discarded, blood-stained cloth and began to clean the table.
She chose to stay.
The days that followed blurred into a strange, new reality. Naomi lived in the penthouse, a gilded cage with an unparalleled view of her own captivity. Tatsuo was a constant, silent presence. He worked from a stark office at the far end of the apartment, taking meetings with men whose faces were as hard as their quiet voices. She was learning the rhythm of his empire, the silent signals, the deference he commanded without a single raised word. She was also learning him. She noticed the way he held his cup, with his fingers curled just so. She noticed the way his eyes would track her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. He never touched her, not since the night of the attack, but the space between them hummed with a tension that was becoming its own form of contact. One afternoon, a lieutenant named Kyo arrived, his expression grim. He bowed to Tatsuo and they spoke in rapid Japanese, too fast for her to follow completely, but she caught the name, Hashimoto. The rival clan. Tatsuo's face became a mask of cold fury. He gave a series of short, brutal commands. Kyo bowed again and left. Tatsuo walked over to the bar and poured 2 fingers of whiskey. He drank it in one swallow. What is it? Naomi asked from the sofa, where she was pretending to read. He turned to face her, his eyes dark. The Hashimoto clan are getting bolder. They have been making inquiries.
About you.
A chill went through her. Me?
Why?
I told you. They are probing for weakness. He walked to the window, staring down at the city. They believe you are my weakness. Am I? The question was out before she could stop it. It was too honest, too vulnerable. He didn't answer for a long time. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. You are a complication I did not plan for, he finally said, his back still to her. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the truth. The rehook, the moment the floor dropped out again, came 2 nights later. She was woken from a restless sleep by the sound of the elevator. Tatsuo wasn't in the apartment. He'd left hours earlier for a meeting. She crept out of her room, her heart pounding. Kyo and 2 other men stepped out of the elevator, supporting a figure between them. It was Tatsuo. His shirt was ripped and soaked in blood, a dark, glistening stain that spread across his chest and abdomen. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. What happened? Naomi gasped, rushing forward. An ambush, Kyo grunted, his face a mask of sweat and strain. Hashimoto's men. We have a doctor on the way, but we couldn't risk a hospital. They laid him on the large sofa in the living room. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes found hers, a flicker of pained recognition in their depths. Naomi's mind went into overdrive. The doctor was minutes away, but he was losing too much blood. She saw the wound now, a vicious stab wound high on his side, just below the ribs. Pressure, she commanded, surprising herself and the other men with the force in her voice. Get me clean towels from the linen closet. And the first aid kit. Now. Kyo, a man who took orders from no one but Tatsuo, stared at her for a second before nodding and barking orders at his subordinate. Naomi knelt beside Tatsuo, her hands pressing down on the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. It was warm and slick against her skin. Stay with me, she whispered, her face close to his. You do not have permission to die. Do you hear me? His lips moved, but only a faint sound came out. She leaned closer. The doctor? He rasped. Check him. It took her a moment to understand. Check him for what? Loyalty, he breathed, his eyes closing for a second. Hashimoto is inside. Betrayal. The attack wasn't random. Someone on the inside had set it up. The doctor, their own doctor, could be the traitor, sent to finish the job. The blood on her hands suddenly felt colder. Kyo returned with the supplies, his face grim. The doctor is here. He's coming up. Naomi looked at Kyo, then at the unconscious form of her husband. She had to make a choice. Trust the doctor, or trust the warning of a dying man. Stop him, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Do not let him in this apartment. Kyo's eyes widened. But the boss needs. The boss said there's a traitor. She cut him off. We can't take the chance. We'll have to handle this ourselves until we can get someone else we trust. This was it. The line she had never thought she would cross. She was actively taking part in his world, making a life-or-death decision for the head of a criminal empire. Kyo hesitated, his loyalty warring with her command. He looked at Tatsuo, then back at her. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the blood on her hands. He gave a sharp nod and spoke into his phone, telling his men downstairs to hold the doctor. For the next hour, Naomi worked with a frantic, focused intensity she didn't know she possessed. Guided by Kyo, who had some field medic training, she cleaned the wound, packed it, and stitched it closed with a clumsy but effective hand. It was brutal, intimate work. She was saving the life of a man who was, by every definition, a monster. A killer. Her husband. When it was done, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, her entire front splattered with his blood. Tatsuo's breathing was more stable. The bleeding had stopped. He would live. Later, after Kyo and his men had cleaned up and taken positions to guard the apartment, she sat by the sofa, watching him sleep. The city lights cast long shadows across the room. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened. The mask was gone, leaving only the man. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They found her immediately. He tried to sit up, but winced, his hand going to his bandaged side. Don't move, she said softly. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the blood on her clothes, the exhaustion on her face. His expression was unreadable. You saved my life. You would have done the same for me, she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. He reached out, his hand surprisingly steady, and his fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch was feather-light, almost hesitant. It was the most tender gesture he had ever made. "I told myself this was a contract," she whispered, the words tumbling out, raw and honest. "A business arrangement." "I was lying." His eyes held hers. The silence in the room was a living thing, filled with everything they couldn't say. "You are a weakness I cannot afford," he said, his voice rough with pain and something else. "And yet, you are the only strength I have left." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession. A shared truth in a world built on lies. The tension between them snapped, replaced by a fragile, terrifying connection. The enemy's next move came 2 days later. Kyo entered the apartment, his face pale. He didn't speak to Tatsuo, who was now sitting up, recovering with unnatural speed. He spoke to Naomi. "There is a message." From the Hashimoto clan, he held out a tablet. On the screen was a live video feed. It showed a man tied to a chair in a dark, damp room. He was bruised and terrified. It was Bryce. A message was superimposed over the image, in stark English. The American for the wife. They weren't just probing for a weakness anymore. They were using her past to destroy her future. They had targeted her directly, and in doing so, they had just signed their own death warrants. Tatsuo rose to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side, and the look in his eyes was not of a man. It was of an impending apocalypse. Tatsuo's plan was surgical. A ghost team, his most trusted men, would hit the warehouse where Bryce was being held. The objective was simple: eliminate the Hashimoto leadership, retrieve the American, and leave no trace. He was to lead it himself, despite his injury. He forbade Naomi from coming. "You will stay here. You will be safe," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He was already dressed in dark, tactical gear, the man she knew replaced by a soldier preparing for war. "No," Naomi said, standing before him, blocking his path to the door. "You're wrong." His eyes narrowed. "This is not a discussion. Bryce is an arrogant fool," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. "He's also a coward. The Hashimoto boss will be expecting you to come in with guns blazing. He'll use Bryce as a shield. But he won't be expecting me." "Absolutely not." "You're not listening," she insisted, stepping closer. "I know Bryce. I know how to talk to him, how to manipulate him, and I know men like the Hashimoto boss. Their pride is their biggest weakness. Let me be the diversion. Let me walk in there. They'll be so focused on the prize, on the wife, they won't see you coming." It was a reckless, insane idea, but it was also brilliant. Tatsuo stared at her, his mind calculating the odds, weighing the risk against the potential reward. He saw the determination in her eyes, the intelligence. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was offering to be the weapon. "You would be putting yourself in the center of the danger," he said, his voice low. "I'm already there," she replied. "There's no safe place for me anymore. The only way out is through." He saw the truth in her words. He had brought this world to her doorstep. She was simply choosing to walk through the door. He gave a single, sharp nod. The plan was changed. An hour later, Naomi walked toward the derelict warehouse on the edge of the Tokyo Bay. She wore a simple black dress, her hands empty. Kyo's voice was a calm presence in the tiny earpiece she wore. "They see you. They are letting you approach. We are in position." 2 guards met her at the door, patting her down roughly before shoving her inside. The air was thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. In the center of the vast, open space, lit by a single bare bulb, sat the head of the Hashimoto clan, a cruel-looking man with a dragon tattoo that covered his entire neck. And tied to a chair beside him, whimpering, was Bryce. When Bryce saw her, his eyes widened first with hope, then with confusion and terror. "Naomi? What are you doing? Get out of here." Silence. Hashimoto snapped, backhanding Bryce across the face. He turned his cold eyes to Naomi. "The beautiful wife. Your husband has more taste than sense. To trade an empire for a woman." "He's not trading anything," Naomi said, forcing her voice to remain calm. She walked closer, stopping just out of his reach. "He sent me to negotiate." Hashimoto laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Negotiate? There is nothing to negotiate. I have his weakness right here. He gestured to Bryce. You have the wrong man, Naomi said, her eyes locked on his. She took another step. That is not his weakness. That is my garbage. Something I threw away a long time ago. She looked at Bryce with pure, unadulterated pity. He means nothing to me, and even less to my husband. Bryce stared at her, his mouth agape. Hashimoto's smirk faltered. This was not the reaction he expected. You're lying, he snarled. Am I? Naomi said. You kidnapped my ex-boyfriend. You think that gives you leverage? It's an embarrassment. My husband is not angry. He's insulted. That you think so little of him. That you think he would care about this pathetic piece of my past. She had his attention now. His pride was pricked. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw. This was her opening. He sent me to deliver a message, she continued, her voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. He is willing to overlook this insult. He is even willing to offer you a piece of the Shinjuku territory. In exchange for your loyalty. It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, tempting lie. Hashimoto's greed warred with his suspicion. Why would he do that? Because you have proven you are a man of action, Naomi said, laying the flattery on thick. He respects that. He would rather have you as an ally than an enemy. He sent me, his wife, as a sign of his trust, to show you the respect he feels you are owed. She could see him considering it. The seed of doubt was planted. His men were relaxing, listening to the unbelievable offer. It was the moment. Now, she whispered into her sleeve. The world exploded. The lights went out, plunging the warehouse into absolute darkness. The silenced gunshots were like coughs in the night. Men screamed. Bodies fell. It was chaos, swift and brutal. Naomi dropped to the floor, as she'd been instructed. When the emergency lights flickered on seconds later, it was over. Tatsuo's men stood over the bodies of the Hashimoto clan. And Tatsuo himself stood before the clan boss, his face a mask of cold retribution. Hashimoto was alive, but his guards were not. Tatsuo didn't even glance at Naomi. He walked to Bryce, who was sobbing in his chair, and with a single, sharp motion, cut his bonds with a knife. Get out, he said, his voice flat. Bryce scrambled away, not looking back. He would be put on the first plane back to America, a ghost haunted by the world he had accidentally touched. Then Tatsuo turned to Hashimoto. You took something of mine, he said, his voice dangerously soft. You tried to use her against me. She is just a woman. Hashimoto spat, defiant to the end. Tatsuo's hand shot out, grabbing the man by his tattooed throat. She is everything, he said, and the words were a death sentence. Back in the penthouse, the silence was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the aftermath, with the choices they had made. Naomi stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had lied and manipulated and walked into the heart of the fire, and she had not been burned. She had been forged. She heard him approach. He stopped behind her, so close she could feel the heat of his body. He was injured, tired, but he was alive. They were alive. In my world, he said, his voice quiet in the dawn light, loyalty is a weapon. Trust is a shield. Tonight, you are my entire arsenal. It was the closest he might ever come to saying what he felt. She didn't need the words. She understood. He took her left hand, the one Bryce had mocked for being bare. She expected a ring, a symbol, a concession to the world they had left behind. But he didn't offer one. Instead, he turned her hand over, his thumb tracing the delicate lines of her palm, then resting on the pulse point at her wrist. He felt the steady, strong beat of her heart. It was not a proposal. It was not a promise of love. It was a statement of fact. A claim. He was hers and she was his. In this world of violence and shadows, they had found their own brutal kind of truth. Naomi didn't pull away. She leaned back against him, her head resting on his chest, and watched the new day begin. She had made her choice, not in a sterile office signing a contract, but in a bloody warehouse, with lies as her weapon and his life in her hands. She had chosen this man, this life, this dangerous, absolute certainty. And she would never look back.